My name is Dennis Speed, and on behalf of the LaRouche Political Action Committee, I want to welcome everyone to today's Dialogue with LaRouche. This is the fifth class in an eight-part class series being given by myself and Will Wertz on LaRouche's economic method and concepts. Uh, as well, we precede that class with a brief reference to the events that have changed the entire potential of the planet. Um, what we're going to do is show you a short excerpt from yesterday's webcast done by Matt Ogden, because it has a kind of a summary view of what's actually going on, as opposed to various of the forms of the weeping and gnashing of teeth of those lamenting the destruction of Babylon or their Babylonian outlook. Um, to be specific, because of what President Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin did last Monday, the world has been changed in a fundamental way. But there's a reason they did it. And that's what our excerpt is going to document for you. So let's go right to our Friday webcast excerpt.
Problems, but they can all be solved. So that's his attitude about what the goal is in this relationship with the United States and Russia. And obviously, everything that he listed there are very, very positive. These are not bad things, but these are, in fact, very good. Stopping terrorism, resolving the nuclear arms race, cybersecurity, trade, and most notably, Middle East peace, North Korea, and resolving the crisis in Ukraine. And obviously, none of these could occur unless we have the reopening of a constructive dialogue with the head of state of the Russian Federation. As both President Trump and President Putin made the point very emphatically during their press conference in Helsinki, the United States and Russia are the world's two leading nuclear superpowers, possessing between the two countries combined over 90% of all of the nuclear weapons in the entire world. And perhaps to make the point even more clearly, just a couple of days after the Helsinki summit occurred this week, Russia conducted a whole round of tests of the entire range of their new next generation strategic weapons. These are the weapons that Putin had revealed during his major address to the Federal Assembly back in March. And as you can see here, this is just an example. Here's a headline that reads, Vladimir Putin tests nuclear-powered cruise missile with unlimited range just days after meeting Donald Trump. And the subhead is, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense, the apocalyptic weapon can reach any desired target on the planet. So these tests included the laser-powered weapons, the nuclear-powered drones, but most notably, it included the new Borovetsnik nuclear-powered intercontinental missile with unlimited range. This is what Putin had stated during that conference, that address to the Federal Assembly back in March. This missile can outmaneuver any known existing missile defense system, since it does not follow the normal ballistic trajectory, which is what all missile defense systems are based on. This missile is apparently highly maneuverable. It's able to change its trajectory constantly in flight, and it can fly for an indefinite, unlimited period of time because it's nuclear powered and it will never run out of fuel. So they just tested this weapon just less than 48 hours after this summit concluded, perhaps to underscore that, in fact, this is an existential necessity that the United States and Russia have these talks and resolve what is becoming a very dangerous escalation in this nuclear weapons arms race. So as Putin described these weapons in his speech last March to the Federal Assembly, he said, quote, "It is a low-flying stealth missile carrying a nuclear warhead with almost an unlimited range, unpredictable trajectory, and ability to bypass interception boundaries. It is invincible against all existing and prospective missile defense and counter-air defense systems. He said, the missile bypasses interceptors. As the range is unlimited, the missile can maneuver for as long as necessary. No other country has developed anything like this. There will be something similar one day, but by that time, our guys will have come up with something even better. He went on, we are not threatening anyone. We're not going to attack anyone or take away anything from anyone with a threat of weapons. We do not need anything, just the opposite. I deem it necessary to emphasize, and it is very important, that Russia's growing military power is a solid guarantee of global peace, as this power preserves and will preserve strategic parity and the balance of forces in the world, which, as is known, have been and remain a key factor of international security after World War II and up to the present day. Now, we have to be aware of this reality and be sure that everything I've said today is not a bluff. And it is not a bluff, believe me. And to give it a thought and dismiss those who live in the past and are unable to look into the future, to stop rocking the boat that we are all in, which is called the Earth. There should be no doubt about this whatsoever, he said. There is no need to create more threats to the world. Instead, let us sit down at the negotiating table and devise together a new and relevant system of international security and sustainable development for human civilization. Even if our views clash on some issues, we will remain partners because we must work together to respond to the most complex challenges, ensure global security, and build the future world, which is becoming increasingly interconnected with more and more dynamic integration processes. Colleagues, this is a turning point for the entire world, and those who are willing and able to change, those who are taking action and moving forward, will take the lead. We must be bold in our plans and actions, take responsibility and initiative, changing the world for the better. Now, this is the context in which these talks between President Putin and President Trump are taking place. These weapons tests, what President Putin had announced as this new generation of strategic weapons, which far surpassed any existing known missile defense systems. And now these tests proving that, in fact, this capability does exist. This is the context in which these talks are taking place. This is a question of war and peace. This is a question of how to avoid the existential threat of a catastrophic nuclear war, which could lead to the extinction of the entire human race and the elimination of civilization on the entire planet. This is not a silly soap opera, or as the press would have you believe. This is not a question of what did Trump say, what did Trump not say? Is he being played by KGB special agent, his handler, so-called, Vladimir Putin? No, this is the head of state of the United States and the head of state of Russia, the two leading nuclear superpowers on this planet, having very important strategic talks, a breakthrough, which is a very positive thing for civilization. So escape this narrative that this is a silly soap opera, or as Trump called it in another tweet, a boxing match. As he said, Putin and I discussed many important subjects at our earlier meeting. We got along well, which truly bothered many haters who wanted to see a boxing match. Big results to come, he said. But as
from the last 3 weeks, both Will and I have emphasized a particular document that Lyndon LaRouche wrote in 1984. I included in my class the second week, Will included in his class, and I also referenced it in the last class. And one section of that, the draft memorandum of agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union, this was written back in 1984. Lynn said, the political foundation for durable peace must be A, the unconditional sovereignty of each and all nation states, and B, cooperation among sovereign nation states to the effect of promoting unlimited opportunities to participate in the benefits of technological progress to the mutual benefit of each and all. The most crucial feature of present implementation of such policy of durable peace, profound change in monetary, economic, and political relations between the dominant powers and those relatively subordinated nations often classified as developing nations. Unless the inequities lingering in the aftermath of modern colonialism are progressively remedied, there can be no durable peace on this planet. And that's the end of the segment. Our recent publication of our New Silk Road second edition report and our report extending the Silk Road to Southwest Asia, the Belt and Road Initiative to Southwest Asia and Africa, are implementations of that draft memorandum of agreement. But what's important to just reference here as we segue now into the class is that new physical principles have been applied by the Russian Federation in military affairs, but these new physical principles are actually derivative of the discussion that Lyndon LaRouche began back in 1981-82 as a back channel government authorized by the Reagan administration with the then Soviet Union, and those negotiations were rejected at that time. They were renewed, and they have been renewed by the present president of the United States. This is not to say they're in the form that they were in, because Lyndon LaRouche was not involved in those negotiations. But the matters that are actually being discussed, the matters that are actually before the American people, the matters that are actually before the world, are exactly as was just indicated. And it goes right to the core of what this class is about. Just to say one last thing, and then I'll introduce Will for section number 5 of the class. Some of you know that the South African Long Telescope, which is a sort of a set of 64 radio telescopes set in the South African wilderness. This past week, 8 days, I think about on July 13th, took some pictures of the center of the Milky Way, so-called black hole of the Milky Way. And those photos, again, revealed filaments in this case that were not understood to exist in the middle of a black hole. They look like large, almost snake-like formations. They're familiar to some of us who, since the 70s, have followed thermonuclear fusion research, because these same sort of formations are found as self-organizing structures within fusion ignition, as that was shown in some of the test reactors of the 1970s, particularly the tokamak reactor at Princeton and a couple of others. What's important is that process in South Africa that happened and the Trump-Putin summit far overshadowed the pathetic and silly appearance of Barack Obama, who went to South Africa on July 18th to desecrate the image of Nelson Mandela. I just note that because you probably don't even know anything about it. And that's exactly the way that history will record the freakout that you've been seeing this week. No one will know about it. For those who have been somewhat preoccupied or distracted, or as we often say, bamboozled by these matters, we simply say to you, please try to pay closer attention to what the intent is of what we're trying to get across in our classes and what we're trying to say to you about where the human race really stands today. I'd just like to say about that South African development that it's actually part of a bigger project, which is called the Square Kilometer Array, which is creating now the largest telescope in the world, which will span Africa and Australia, create an aperture that large so that we can peer into space. And that the kinds of things that Trump and Putin are capable of discussing, if we do our job, is they are able to discuss many of the concepts that Lyndon LaRouche uniquely advanced during the period of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s and into the turn of this present century. His economics, as we talk about it, is at the very forefront of human scientific inquiry. And that's what we hope to continue to direct, that you might think about as these classes proceed. So at this point, I want to introduce Will for part 5 of our class series.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. So what I'm going to do today will be somewhat unique because I've invited a guest speaker, Lyndon LaRouche. And this is in the form of a videotape which he produced back in 1984. People know that Lyndon LaRouche ran for president a number of times, beginning in 1976, 1980, 1984. After the 1984 elections, he produced a videotape called The Power of Labor, which is, I think, about 2 hours long. And this was to accompany a book, a textbook on economics called So, Do You Wish to Learn About Economics? And back in that time, what we did is we would go out, and a number of us go out and give classes on economics, which would begin by showing a part of that videotape, The Power of Labor, and then following it with a further discussion of what is presented in the segments of that tape, in conjunction with So You Wish to Learn About Economics. And what I've done today is I've selected 3 excerpts from that videotape. The first is the most extensive. It's about 20 minutes long. And then there are 2 shorter segments, approximately 5 minutes each. So it's a total of about a half an hour. And in a certain sense, these segments, these excerpts, bring together in LaRouche's own voice much of what Dennis and I have presented in the first 4 classes in this 8-part series. So I thought it would be very important for people to hear Lyndon LaRouche directly on these issues, which we have been addressing and will continue to address in the upcoming presentations. And the fundamental issue which I want to address is the question, excuse me, of technological progress. And what we've experienced really increasingly since World War II has been a very deliberate shift away from a commitment to technological progress, a shift away from a conception of productive labor, and a shift in our educational system, which is coherent with that. For instance, there was a whole school of educational theory called deschooling back in the 1960s. And the basic idea was that you shouldn't have education. What you need is unschooling. And I know of this because my late wife, Mariana, actually got a master's degree in education at Harvard, which is supposed to be a premier institution. And all she learned was, in studying education, how to deschool. That was the subject matter presented. And of course, we've had a shift away from physical sciences as an emphasis towards social sciences, various ologies, sociology, anthropology, so forth and so on. We've had an increase in the teaching of existentialism, whether that's Nietzsche or Heidegger or what have you, on the campuses. I know I experienced this when I went to university back in the 1960s. In retrospect, my education in high school was far better than what I received at the university because of the shift that was already occurring at that point. And all of this is a reflection of a shift towards the so-called post-industrial society. And this, as I said, was a very deliberate countercultural paradigm shift after World War II. And it was orchestrated by what we call the Anglo-Dutch liberal system, which goes back to the Dutch and the British East India companies, which have continued to be an active operation against the American system of political economy. As evidenced, for instance, by the World Wildlife Fund, which was created by Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, and also involved the participation of Prince Philip of the British royal family. They were really the two pillars of the World Wildlife Fund. And all of the various campaigns that have occurred over the last decades against technological progress have really been a reflection of this Anglo-Dutch liberal outlook. For instance, the book, The Limits to Growth, which argues that there are limited resources, therefore we shouldn't have technological progress because it will just use up those resources more rapidly. The global warming ideology of Al Gore and others. In education, you see the emphasis upon teaching students to pass exams, standardized exams, as opposed to what is the real nature of education, as expressed, for instance, by Alexander von Humboldt, which is to evoke creativity in the student, particularly through allowing the student to relive unique experiments which have been undertaken and have resulted in revolutions in thought throughout history. So as to really encourage that kind of state of mind in a student. Discovery, breaking out of the jailhouse of false axiomatic assumptions to develop something new. That was replaced by deschooling, by political correctness, by excuse me, this practice of reducing education to teaching students to pass a standardized exam. So the basic idea, and of course you have all of the green ideology, the emphasis upon appropriate technologies for developing sector countries, which was advocated by the World Bank and still is advocated by the World Bank. For instance, you have a discussion now in Europe, including in Germany, of the Marshall Plan for Africa. But the Germans are what they mean by a Marshall Plan for Africa is solar panels and alternative energy sources, because of course they themselves have committed themselves to abandoning nuclear energy and even coal-fired energy plants. So this is not what we're talking about in terms of a Marshall Plan for Africa, nor is it what the Chinese are doing or what the Russians intend. But this is the ideology which is taking place. It's an ideology of post-industrial society. And what we are engaged in, what Lyndon LaRouche has been engaged in for decades, is to bring about a reverse paradigm shift back to a conception, scientifically based, of productive labor, of technological progress as the necessity for a society to progress and not collapse. Could I have the first slide? Okay. Now, this is oh, is this the what do you press? Okay. Okay, great. All right. So this is this runs from 1944 until 1979, and it's a reflection of the composition of the U.S. labor force. As you can see, in 1944, that is at the end of the war, the non-productive sector of the workforce was only 37%, and the remaining, so that would be 63% total, was engaged in productive activity, with a very significant portion of that in manufacturing, 34%. I think that's transportation. We have construction, transportation 8%, construction 2%. Then you have mining 2%, and agriculture was 18%. As you can see, by the time we reached 1979, the non-productive sector of the economy has grown to 62%. Manufacturing has declined from 34% to 23%. And this trend continued after that. So you have a significant reduction. You're talking about 38% of the workforce in 1979 in the United States was engaged in productive forms of employment. That is actually changing nature through introduction of mechanization, technology, and so forth. And this is a reflection of this problem of a post-industrial society. The argument is against the necessity of technological progress. We don't need to be engaged in production. Actually, it's detrimental because we'll use up resources. Right? And of course, if you have this attitude, then there's no need to educate a workforce to be productive, to make scientific breakthroughs for technological progress. Now, there have been some exceptions to this. The Atoms for Peace program under Eisenhower, the Apollo program under Kennedy. I remember after Kennedy ran for president, it was on the basis of the space gap, of the Sputnik gap. There were scholarships given, National Education Defense Act scholarships. That's what they were called. I actually got one in 1967 at the tail end towards the tail end of the Apollo program. So it was to encourage science education. The kind and we don't. That has not been the case. Increasingly, as we went through the 1980s, 1990s, into the 2000s. But this is the process which we must reverse. Next slide, please. Okay, now what I'm going to do here is the following. This is a 20-minute segment with Lyndon LaRouche from this Power of Labor tape. And I would actually encourage people after this to watch the tape as a whole. But this section is very dense. And I gave a class last night to a number of younger people. And what we did, and I'm going to do this here, is we're going to watch the video, but I'm going to pause at certain points on some of the graphics to make some additional comments so that it'll be clear. Because I think if we went through it straight, by the end, you may have had questions which were not answered and may not actually absorb what he's developing as clearly as were we to stop, which is what I propose. And in a certain sense, this will be a dialogue with Lyndon LaRouche. Mm-hmm. And of course, that's the meaning of a dialectical method. His first book was called Dialectical Economics. And it's the case that Plato in his Republic refers to the power of dialectic. And there's one writing which Lyndon LaRouche wrote many years, I'm not sure, many years after his original Dialectical Economics book, in which he referred to it as the method of dialogue. So it's you might call it dialogical or dialogical method. The problem with dialogical is it implies logic, which this is not. Okay, so let's go through this, and I'll signal when I'd like to stop, so I can just make some further comments that may help answer some of your questions.
As a national economy in the following way. We begin with the population as a whole. Since we are measuring increase of potential...
Well, let's just wait.
Since we increase of potential relative population density, we do it. We measure lies in two ways. First,
See this, what he's making is a distinction between productive and non-productive. And this distinction is a scientific distinction which has been in large part eliminated. For instance, John Maynard Keynes, the author of Keynesian economics, made no such distinction. He gives examples, for instance, where you hire someone to dig a hole and fill it with garbage and cover it up. And then you hire somebody else to uncover the hole and extract the garbage. And from his standpoint, it doesn't matter whether this is productive or not. The only thing that counts is that you're paying both workers so they can consume. And what this leaves out, this whole Keynesian economics leaves out, is any conception of real production in the economy, and reduces it to merely consumption. And excuse me. So this is a big problem today, because one of Lyndon LaRouche's proposals is that we issue, as part of his 4 laws, you issue credit for productive purposes. And if there's no agreement as to what's productive, which you don't have, particularly in Congress, because you have people who argue that we should invest in solar power or windmills and not nuclear energy, as an example, or we shouldn't have coal-fired plants, and so forth. If you don't have agreement on what is productive, this is a real impasse in terms of getting the kinds of credit policies that are really necessary, both domestically and also internationally. So I just wanted to make that comment on that distinction, which is fundamental to what Mr. LaRouche develops. So go ahead.
By production itself. That defines the production distribution cycle in general terms. Now focus on figure 2, now showing on your screen. This is a close-up view of the production bar. Note that the bar is divided into 3 major segments, and that the top segment of the bar is divided into 2 subsegments. The middle segment, labeled by the symbol V, capital V, is easily understood. This represents the physical goods portion of the market basket of consumption by those households associated with productive labor. This represents the level of consumption per person required to provide present and future productive labor of the quality required by the technology of production. The lowest of the 3 segments of the production bar, labeled with a symbol capital C, represents goods which must be consumed by production itself simply to maintain production capacity and to maintain also the inventory of goods in production at the same level of volume and productivity. In the upper segment of the bar, labeled by the symbol capital S, is the gross operating profit of our consolidated agro-industrial enterprise. The lower subsegment of the segment labeled S is labeled by the symbol capital D. This represents the portion of total physical goods and transportation output, which is required by both, first, the market basket requirements of households of non-productive labor, the capital goods and analogous requirements of the activities in which non-productive labor force members of these households are employed or unemployed. The remainder, labeled by the symbol S prime, represents the net operating profit of our consolidated agro-industrial enterprise. Now, you can see on your screen chart 1.
Okay, I just want to say
This lists some of the basic.
The letters S, V, and C are actually derived from a British economist, David Ricardo, They were also then adopted by Karl Marx, and Lyndon LaRouche will refer to that, these letters. But what, as Lyndon LaRouche indicates, in other words, the S refers in English to surplus, V in Ricardo to variable capital, C to constant capital. So that's where those letters come from. But what Lyndon LaRouche does is to redefine the meaning of these letters completely so as to reflect the American system of economics as opposed to the British. And in fact, Karl Marx was essentially a branch of British economics, the British system of economics. He did all of his writing in London at the British Library, and he vociferously embraced the economic writings of Ricardo and Adam Smith as representative of capitalism, not recognizing that the British system is actually a mixed system of feudalism and monetarism on the one side, and they only encouraged technology to the extent to which technology was necessary for the preservation of their empire. But it was not the primary focus of what they did. So the American system has a completely different approach to this, where you're focusing on increasing the productive powers of the mind. This is what Alexander Hamilton writes in his report on the subject of manufacturers. This is the critical conception: increasing the productive powers of the mind, and through technological progress, creating the basis for, among other things, a shift out of the percentage involved in agriculture, right? By mechanizing agriculture, by introducing new technologies, fertilizer, irrigation, and so forth, so that fewer people are actually involved in rural employment and more will be involved in manufacturing and other forms of productive labor which involve technological progress. And this is something which, as you remember, Lyndon LaRouche talks about the bar diagram at the beginning as a agro-industrial unit. And one of the problems which China and other third world nations have had to address is how do you shift the composition of your workforce away from being predominantly agriculture, which was what the United States was at its inception, towards increasing involvement in terms of a productive workforce engaged in technology. And you basically reduce the percentage involved in agriculture while you have an increase in the efficiency of agriculture by the addition of technology. Of course, what Alexander Hamilton was polemicizing against was it's called the physiocrat school, which was a French school. And they argued that the source of all wealth is the bounty of nature and the titles to the bounty of nature. And of course, what Hamilton argued is, no, that is not the source of all wealth. Agriculture is not the source of all wealth, or mining, but rather it is the productive powers of labor. That's the source of all wealth. And by enhancing that, you increase the effectiveness of agriculture and mining, while at the same time reducing the amount of labor that's required for it. So why don't we go ahead with these accounting ratios?
Basic ratios of national income accounting. First, basic income accounting ratios. S equal T, where T stands for total physical goods output, less C plus V, gross operating profit. C over V, or C divided by V, is a measure of the capital intensity of production. S divided by C plus V is a measure of productivity. S prime divided by C plus V is a measure of the rate of profit. D divided by C plus V is a measure of the expense ratio. I should warn the viewer against pulling a copy of Karl Marx's Kapital from a library shelf. These accounting definitions here were developed by American system economists, including, of course, U.S. Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, the two Carys, and Friedrich List. Marx did plagiarize as well as denounce these economists, but his definitions of these accounting categories are radically different than those we are using here. It should be fairly obvious from what we have reviewed so far that if the economic process is to describe an increase of potential relative population density, that the physical content of the market basket per person must increase, but that the average amount of labor expended to produce that market basket must decrease. This is expressed by the constraints we have listed.
Let me just add on this. His references to Marx as a plagiarist of the American system economists, while at the same time denouncing them. The point is that it's Alexander Hamilton who developed the concept of the productive powers of labor in his work on the report of substantive manufacturers. He goes back further to the Renaissance and figures such as Nicholas of Cusa, who emphasized that all human beings are created in the living image of the Creator, therefore they are creative, and that creativity, which I think developed in the last class that I gave, of rational entities or hypotheses. That is the source of wealth. So Marx plagiarized the idea of power of labor power, but assigned an inadequate definition to labor power. And at the same time, he criticized Henry C. Carey and Friedrich List because, as you'll see, as we go through this, the thing about the American system is that there is no necessity in the American system of political economy for depressions. None whatsoever. Because if you have technological progress, then you are essentially have, as he will develop, you have a negentropic process which does not necessitate depressions. It is the British system of political economy which generates depressions because it emphasizes speculative investment to the detriment of technological progress. And that's what creates the depression cycles which we've experienced internationally, to the extent to which the American system has not been fully implemented. So you'll see this worked out in the remainder of this segment in terms of the importance of technological progress. But so Marx denounced people like Carey and Friedrich List because he was so thoroughly committed to the British model that his notion of socialism superseding capitalism was derived from his conviction that no, you can't have a system of economy which will not lead to depressions. Therefore, we have to have socialism. So he was thoroughly committed to the British system of economics and denied the American system of economics. So go ahead.
In chart number 2, now on your screen. The conditions, as you see on the chart, are these. First, the per capita market basket output must increase. Also, the per capita market basket consumption. Secondly, the ratio of C over V, or C divided by V, must increase. Thirdly, S, that's the gross operating profit, divided by the sum of the production and labor costs of production, must increase. That is, the gross operating profit ratio must increase. And similarly, fourthly, the net operating profit ratio must increase. S prime over C plus V must increase. Before turning directly to the matter of technology as such, we must pass through an intermediate next step. It is the case that as the potential relative population density rises, the number of kilowatt hours of usable energy consumed by society increases both per capita and per square kilometer. There's no need to go into the details of the matter in this broadcast. It is sufficient to note that we can construct statistical functions which show a relationship between rising potential relative population density and increase of kilowatt hours of consumption per capita. It is clearly necessary to construct a thermodynamic image of economic processes. It happens to be necessary to do so to isolate the most crucial fact about the kinds of economic processes we are describing in this broadcast. It is high school thermodynamics to say that the simple analysis of any thermodynamic process proceeds in the following way. First, we divide the total amount of the heat equivalent transmitted through any process into two general categories. In the first category, we include the portion of the energy throughput which the process itself must consume to prevent itself from running down. We use the term running down in the sense of the unwinding of the mainspring of a mechanical clock. We call this portion of the energy throughput the energy of the system. This includes the waste heat consumed, such as frictional losses. If the total energy throughput is greater than this energy of the system, we identify the remainder as the process's free energy. In the economic analysis we've just described, the combined productive costs and overhead expenses, as shown on chart 3 on your screen, correspond.
Okay, so we'll make one point here. People who remember, I guess it was my last class, in a discussion of, well, no, it was the first class when I was discussing LaRouche's refutation of Norbert Wiener. Wiener's assumption is that the universe as a whole is entropic. And this is what Newton and his associate Clarke argued in a correspondence with Gottfried Leibniz. And their idea was that the universe as a whole was like a mechanical clock which winds down. And what Norbert Wiener argued is that you could have neg entropy in an island of a successful human economy, but that if you did that, but that the more successful you were in reversing entropy in a human economy, the more rapidly entropy would assert itself. This is like the idea that if you have technological progress, you're going to exhaust the limited resources, so-called limited resources, and your economy will collapse as a result of the technological progress. So what LaRouche is talking about here is the universe is negentropic, and it's only if you have a society which halts technological progress that you would have the winding down of a clock phenomenon. But the actual nature of a successful economy is introducing technological progress and thus mirroring in human economy what is the nature of the physical universe as a whole, which is negentropic. So go ahead.
To the energy of the system of the economic process. The net operating profit, S prime, represents the free energy of the economic process. Just note the categories we use to measure these kinds of relationships. The sum of C plus V plus D represents the energy of the system. The sum of C plus V represents the energy of the system of production itself. S prime represents the free energy of the economic process. S prime over C plus V is the ratio of the free energy to energy of the system of production. S prime over C plus V plus D represents the ratio of free energy to energy of the system for the society as a whole. Although the proper term for energy of the system is the sum of C plus V plus D, overhead expense includes a variety of components which vary in a way which has no functional relationship to the development of the economic process. Governmental expense and pure waste, for example, may increase in a way which has no relationship to the processes of production themselves, except as a kind of arbitrary tax on the wealth produced by the productive process. For that reason, we use the ratio S prime over C plus V as a substitute for S prime over C plus V plus D. Just as we were concerned chiefly with changes in the rate of net operating profit in national income accounting, in elementary thermodynamics, we are concerned with changes in the ratio of free energy to energy of the system. In thermodynamic processes, in which the energy of the system is greater than the energy throughput over successive cycles of the process, we say that the process is entropic. In chart 4, we've indicated summarily some of the conditions which distinguish between a negentropic, that is a positive process, and an entropic, a process which is running down. In the case that the S prime over C plus V is always negative in value, the system is entropic. In the case in which S prime over C plus V is becoming and will remain negative, the system is entropic. When the S prime over C plus V is always positive in the present and future, the system is negentropic. When S prime over C plus V is becoming and remaining positive, even though it may be negative at the present, we say also it is negentropic. If it is both positive and increasing, it is definitely negentropic. If S prime over C plus V is positive but decreasing, it may be considered relatively entropic. That it is not yet an entropic process, but it's tending to become entropic. If S prime over C plus V is negative and falling at an accelerating rate, we describe the process not only as entropic, but as degenerate. Entropic has the general meaning of running down, as we used that term earlier. In a few minutes, we shall introduce a proper meaning of negentropic. But for the present moment, the way we're using the term here is obvious. It should require little explanation to say now that the consolidated agricultural-industrial enterprise being analyzed is assumed to be a closed thermodynamic model, in the sense that all of the sources of energy are from within the economic process being studied, and that all the energy transmitted is being consumed by the process or is being given off as waste. This means that we must concentrate our attention on the effects of reinvestment of the free energy or net operating profit back into the process which is generating it. At first glance, it seems to be inevitable that reinvesting the free energy must have the effect of increasing the per capita energy of the system. This is certainly the case if the population or if the local productive labor force is not increased in number. Now, let us consider a hypothetical case for the moment to get this idea clearer in our minds. Let us imagine the hypothetical case that an economy which has been chugging along at some rate of technological progress suddenly decides to halt all technological improvement in the capital goods it produces. However, this economy continues to invest its free energy or net operating profits in the productive process. Okay, now chart 5 shows the effects of this type of investment in terms of relationships in the economy measured per capita. That is, we are assuming that the society has halted technological progress in capital goods design at that point, and that all of the available net operating profit is being reinvested. In this case, the rate of profit will decrease, as is shown, S prime over C plus V being greater, that is today, being greater than the equivalent value tomorrow. And that is shown by the ratio which shows the numerator as being S prime minus D S prime, where D in this case signifies differential, where the denominator is V plus C plus D S prime. Therefore, the rate of profit is declining. But we have also to consider the fact that the costs of production are being increased as a result of depletion. We noted earlier that whenever a process, a society, is functioning in a fixed technological mode, the effect of depletion is to raise costs. Therefore, we must add these rises in costs to the numerator of the and denominator of the expression. And therefore, the process, an economic process, which is investing in this mode, would be entropic. In other words, the economy would be in.
All right. So I just want to just make clear, this is the case where you have no technological progress And there are two elements here which result in a decrease in the net operating process and therefore the free energy of the system. The first is if you have no new technological progress, you're merely reinvesting the net profit in the existing capital stock, and that takes that portion of the net profit is ds prime. So that you have that element, and then the second element is the increasing cost as a result of depletion of the resources which are defined by a constant level of technology, where you're not developing new types of technology. It's a very simple thing. For instance, if you have a one example that Lyndon LaRouche has used, if you have a wood-burning society, after you burn all the trees in your immediate vicinity, then you've got to go further and further away to harvest trees, and you get an increase in the cost, transportation costs, among other things, of doing that. And at a certain point, you get to the point where there are no more trees. So that's the depletion costs if you stay in a fixed mode of production without technological progress. So those are the two elements. One results in relative entropy, and the second, combined with that, results in an entropic situation where the society actually does collapse.
The process of running down. To assist you in following the simple set of comparisons in chart 5, consider the following elementary facts. First, at first, the cutting off of technological improvements in capital goods will not halt technological progress. As newly purchased capital goods replace obsolete stocks of capital goods, the productivity of labor will be increased. However, as more and more of the old capital goods stocks are replaced, there will be less and less increase in the productivity of labor caused by new purchases of capital stocks. Second, at that point, the point at which the obsolete stocks are replaced, or being nearly replaced, the per capita rate of S will decline by a combined factor of minus ds prime minus function of u. The term ds prime signifies some differential, some portion of S prime is being added as a cost factor, the increased energy of the system cost, the system. Function of U in this case signifies the economic effects of depletion of natural resources. So that the profit is being reduced by this factor at the same time that the denomination of the ratio will be increased by an amount correlating with plus ds prime. Third, therefore, the process will become absolutely entropic. This is another way of stating what we stated earlier. Without technological progress, a society must collapse. We stated at that earlier point of the broadcast that technological progress solves this problem. Let us restate the function of technological progress in the terms of reference of national income counting, the model we have described so far. This brings us to chart 6. Chart 6 simply gives you an example, a worked out example of what we were described just before. If the improved technology of new issues of capital goods results in an increase of the productivity of labor by, for example, 10%, then the amount of C required to meeting C's energy of the system requirement is about 90% of the labor cost as measured at a preceding lower rate of productivity. In this case, let K represent the factor of improved productivity correlated with improved capital goods purchased. Then, as you see the calculations on your screen, you see that this results in this case, an improvement in the rate of profit. Therefore, as technological progress in this way, in the manner indicated on the screen on chart 6, causes a rise in the rate of profit, whereas in a society which reinvestment is occurring under conditions of fixed technology, reinvestment of profit in industry causes a decline in the rate of profit. In this case, as shown in chart 6, unless there is a very high rate of depletion of natural resources, the rate of profit must increase over successive reinvestment cycles. Or, for a more rigorous examination of the same point, look now at chart 7 on the screen. You see the comparison made. First, we're comparing the rate of profit in the before the new investment is made and the rate of profit after the new investment is made. And therefore, if the productivity is increasing, as shown, the process is at least relatively negentropic. If the rate of increase in the rate of profit is greater than the increased energy of the system costs plus the depletion costs, then the process is absolutely negentropic. The discussion of charts 1 through 7 has now situated the significance of the term negentropy in terms of national income accounting.
Okay, just as a further explication of that, if you look at, I think it's in chapter 4 of So You Wish to Learn About Economics, the point that he makes, and I think this even clarifies it further, if your existing capital goods, your machine tools, produce a product, a new capital good or a new machine tool, which is more productive than the existing. That is, he says, that's exactly the location in which you can see the technological progress reflecting negentropy. So that's in other words, but if you don't have technological progress, if you halt it, you don't get that jump from one mode of production producing a higher, more productive form of production. So go ahead. Let's. I just have this just to go back to his initial discussion of an agro-industrial economy and how he divides up the productive bars in terms of, that's right, I've got this laser, in terms of the 3 sectors: youth, that is below entering the workforce; mature, which is those in the workforce; and then the elder. And then you see you have the agriculture at the bottom, similar division of the population, and its product, which, for instance, contributes to the input into the productive labor force, and actually it ends up going up here also to the non-productive labor force, and of course you have this line from the production of the productive labor force. You have this going down, the addition to the agricultural population, which is then reflected in terms of its into the input into the agricultural production, making it more productive. So go ahead. Okay, now this is another book that Lyndon LaRouche wrote. It's actually called Science of Christian Economy, and the subtitle is there, and Other Prison Writings by Lyndon H. LaRouche Jr. So he wrote this while in prison. This includes one writing in defense of common sense. When I was in prison with Lyndon LaRouche, this was in Alexandria, Virginia, back in 1989. We were there for 6 months to work on our joint appeal, which was not ultimately successful, given the persecution directed at us. But he wrote, just you get a sense of his devotion and commitment. We were sharing a cell, and this was very sparse circumstances. There was a cement slab, and then you have one of these like exercise pads, the length of the slab. So he slept on that. and I had the same kind of foam pad, and I slept on the floor. And I don't know whether you have recycling bins, and I know in Virginia we have these. It's about so long and about so wide, and all of your earthly possessions have to be in one of these like recycling bins, right? And so that was the conditions under which we were operating. And of course, you had no reference books, he had no typewriter, no computer for sure. So he wrote In Defense of Common Sense during that 6-month period, by hand with a pencil on a line pad, right? And then sent them out. So at any rate, these are a set of general inequalities that must be satisfied. So it's a further reflection on these bar diagrams. First, the per capita leisure and physical consumption of the family household must be improved, but under the condition that the per capita and per hectare physical output of the whole society increases more rapidly than the per capita household goods and consumption. So you have to have an increase in the living standard of the population, the family households. But the only way that can really be sustained is if the physical output, that is the V, increases at a higher rate than the household consumption. Next one. That with technological progress, the school leaving age must increase asymptotically toward an average upper limit. This requires corresponding increases in health and longevity. All right. So the point here is that in a productive economy, I mean, he's estimated that perhaps the school leaving age would eventually be 25. Right. So if society is going to be investing in the production of a productive individual to the age of 25, then you've got to ensure health. You've got to ensure longevity. Right. So this goes back to the non-productive sector in the original bar diagram, and the letter D. Right, which reflects the non-productive sector's consumption. The point being that, as he said, there are useful and necessary non-productive functions: science, education, health. There are various institutional requirements which are additionally needed, administrative requirements, and so forth. But there, at the same time, the problem that we have is that there's been a growth of the non-productive sector in respect to non-essential, wasteful overhead. So this just underscores that there is a necessity for certain socially necessary functions like health and increasing longevity of the population, and of course education, which means that you have to have a significant improvement in education. Third, that with technological progress, the ratio of required employment in physical production and manufacturing and basic economic infrastructure must increase relative to agriculture and related activity up to a lower asymptotic limit for the latter in terms of agriculture. You remember the diagram I gave you in terms of the shift in the composition of the workforce at the beginning. You had after World War II, you had a significant portion of the population involved in agriculture, and then that dropped. Now, in general, you want to have a drop in the proportion involved in agriculture, but there's something else which goes on which you don't want, which is the elimination of the family farmer, which is what's actually occurred. By the fact that we did not insist upon the regulation of parity prices for U.S. farmers. We had fought for this, for many years. In other words, the idea here is that if the price that a family farmer receives for their agricultural product is less than the cost to them of producing it, they go bankrupt. So you have to establish, and we've had this in our history, a parity price. At least the cost of production has to at least be the level that they're of the price they're going to receive, preferably higher, for them to really expand and function. So what we've had under free trade policies and deregulation of parity prices is a destruction of the family farmer. And also, this also reflects the post-industrial shift, because many young people don't go into don't continue with the family farm. So we have a demographic problem in our farm sector, which is that many farmers or most farmers are actually beyond retirement age. Probably an average of the age of a U.S. farmer could be in the range of 70 years of age, which is certainly not a policy that should be tolerated. Next slide. With technological progress, physical productive employment in producers' goods must increase relative to that of physical production of household goods. So again, this is the idea that you're increasing the standard of living of your workforce, but what you must ensure is it's the ratio of C divided by V must increase. That is, there has to be increased investment in capital goods and the capital intensity of capital goods to sustain the increased living standard of your productive population. Fifth, that with technological progress, we must increase not only the quantity of energy available per capita area of potential population density, we must increase the effective intensity of the applied energy. Next slide. And this is, you can see this in a number of sources, but basically, this is the other issue, which is that he developed earlier. You have to have an increase in energy flux density in order to have an increase in the rate of profit of the economy as a whole. So right away, you look at on the right-hand column, density in kilowatt. I can't actually read that. Kilowatts per square meter. Solar energy is extraordinarily low compared to fossil fuels. Compare solar at the sun's surface, which of course we're not harnessing. Nobody's proposing to do that at the moment. Fission power, and fusion power. So from that standpoint of an industrial, technologically advancing economy, you have to have fission, you have to have fossil fuels. But of course, fission and fusion are far in advance of even fossil fuels. So your orientation is, even as you're using fossil fuels, you have to make a shift towards fission and towards fusion, which has the same energy flux density in its first commercial types as fission, but then vastly expands beyond that. And then, of course, the costs, it's insane, the cost of solar and similar renewable energy forms compared to nuclear energy and even fusion energy in its early forms. So I just wanted to raise that again in this overall context. So next slide. So let's go forward. I want to go to the next clip of Lyndon LaRouche. This one. Okay. Let me just say, so he's going to develop now the whole question of higher hypotheses, which is the notion of, which is the source of the creation of technological progress through scientific breakthroughs.
Species of scientific hypothesis are in ascending order of rank. First, simple hypothesis. Second, higher hypothesis. Third, hypothesis of the higher hypothesis. I shall now briefly explain what is meant by each. First, simple hypothesis. Accept the axioms and postulates of some chosen, established body of knowledge as valid. Then, given a phenomenon to be made a subject of such a body of knowledge, construct an assumed analysis of cause and effect relations bearing upon the occurrence and consequences of that phenomenon. This assumption, or simple hypothesis, must be completely consistent with the axioms and postulates of the chosen variety of established body of knowledge. If the explanation of the experimental evidence is consistent with the axioms and postulates, then the hypothesis is treated as proven. In layman's language, this means that one avoids adopting any assumptions which conflict with underlying assumptions of prevailing opinion. This usage of prevailing opinion may indicate the views of some faction within scientific work, or simply the prevailing opinions of some group of people among which one seeks to cultivate a good opinion of oneself. Second, higher hypothesis. In this case, the purpose of the hypothesis is to overthrow one or more of the axioms and postulates of some accepted body of scientific or other opinion. One adopts as the test of this higher hypothesis some simple or experimental observation appropriate to that purpose. If the experimental hypothesis succeeds in proving its assumption, the whole body of knowledge associated with the disproven axioms and postulates is overturned and must be reconstructed entirely on the basis of the higher hypothesis just proven. All fundamental scientific discoveries are of the form of such proven higher hypothesis. This is the kind of thinking responsible for all scientific revolutions. Although the breadth of application of an existing body of scientific knowledge can be expanded by means of simple hypothesis, no valid fundamental discovery in science could be accomplished by the method of simple hypothesis. Neither can any discovery made by higher hypothesis be called competently into question by the method of simple hypothesis. Higher hypothesis is the lowest possible level of creative scientific thinking. Simple hypothesis represents thinking one level below creative scientific thinking. Third, hypothesis of the higher hypothesis. Although successive and valid scientific revolutions must, by their nature, contradict one another, their relative validity, relative to lower levels of scientific progress, is not to be doubted. The fact that mankind has produced successive and successful scientific revolutions shows us that there are principles of scientific discovery which are approximately the same for successive scientific revolutions. A principle which efficiently generates successive scientific revolutions is an hypothesis of the higher hypothesis. In other words, an hypothesis whose subject matter is a principle proven to be efficient in generating successive, successful scientific revolutions. Such a principle is subject to certain definite kinds of empirical tests and therefore can be proven. This is the highest form of creative scientific thinking, the highest form of thinking possible for mankind.
Okay, what I now just to say again, this goes to this concept comes from Plato's Republic. I believe it's in the sixth book of Plato's Republic. And if people have questions about that, I can go into that in discussion later. But this is also what Lyndon LaRouche discovered when he was studying Riemann and contour back in the 1948-52 period. Because if you saw the first class I gave, in Riemann, he has the conception of doubly extended manifolds, triply extended manifolds, and contour develops which would be a sequence of higher hypotheses. And contour develops the concept of transfinite, and that which is the same concept of a higher hypothesis, and that you have beyond a single transfinite conception, you can have higher order transfinite conceptions which have greater power. So that's the conception which is critical in terms of increasing potential relative population density through technological progress. Why don't we skip to the final clip by Lyndon LaRouche. Here we are now.
On the basis of what we just reported concerning the hypothesis of the higher hypothesis, we're able to demystify one of the most profound mysteries in all human experience. How does the creative activity of a single human mind increase the potential relative population density of all mankind? This is the second greatest in importance of all moral questions. It is the greatest of all questions in scientific knowledge. Fact one, a society's increase of its potential relative population density is a negentropic fact, identical in form with the principle of all living processes. Fact two, this increase of potential is caused entirely by the discovery and application of advances in technology. Fact three, the discovery of advances in technology is entirely a creation of human minds taken individually. Fact four, therefore, the cause for the successful existence of society is human individuals' creative mental activity. Fact five, since the result of our creative mental activity, so realized, is a change in the physical process, which is society's economic process. In this way, creative mental activity is an efficient physical force in the universe. Fact six, although each species of increase of potential relative population density, each scientific revolution, is immediately a product of a higher hypothesis, the cause of higher hypothesis is the principle of creative discovery associated with the hypothesis of the higher hypothesis. The hypothesis of the higher hypothesis, therefore, corresponds to some principle which is the substance of the physical force which the creative mental potentialities of the individual human mind exert upon the universe. Plato's Socrates treats this point in the following terms of reference. Fact number 7. The hypothesis of the higher hypothesis, as formulated by the creative powers of the individual mind, is an imperfect approximation. As we lessen the imperfection of that approximation, our knowledge is approaching, without ever fully reaching, that which is truth. Fact 8. Therefore, we must think of the truth as the unhypothesized principle for which the hypothesis of the higher hypothesis searches. This unhypothesized principle is the only true law governing the universe, known in Christian theology as the Logos, the word of the Gospel of St. John. We have already indicated the fact that the moral person, first, identifies personal self-interest as the accomplishment of a good for present and future generations. 2, recognizes that the essential good is the accomplishment of those improvements in the habits and institutions of society which foster and protect the good. 3rd, that the good is the principle of self-development of individuals of society to the effect of increasing the potential relative population density of present and future generations of society. This self-development is of the following form in substance. First, the development of those creative mental powers associated with a higher hypothesis and the hypothesis of the higher hypothesis. Second, the hypothesis of the higher hypothesis is expressed for consciousness in the form of the geometrical principle, exemplified by the succession of the isoparametric principle and the self-similar conic spiral. This geometrical principle is also the measure of technology. Therefore, fourthly, progress in technology is a direct image of creative mental action, of the mental activity which is congruent with the hypothesis of the higher hypothesis. This is the inner secret of the verse from Genesis. We may be fruitful, as Genesis commands, only if we pursue a course of increase of potential relative population density. This cannot be accomplished without developing our creative mental powers for generating successful higher hypotheses. This cannot be accomplished, in turn, unless we develop a less imperfect form of the hypothesis of the higher hypothesis. Whether we are conscious of the idea of the hypothesis of the higher hypothesis or not. This implies the question, is the advancement in the material condition of individual life the purpose of technological progress and development of our creative mental powers merely a means to that end? Or is the development of those powers the true purpose and the goal of technological progress merely the means to oblige us to develop ever more perfectly the notion of the hypothesis of the higher hypothesis? Or a third alternative, is it not the case that both goals are but two inseparable facets of the same purpose? Is man's work merely a goal to his moral development? Or is man's work the complement of that moral development? I believe most profoundly that the two purposes, the moral development of man and the assignment to man of tasks commensurate with his moral development, are one and the same. I believe, therefore, that the ordering of the economic and related policies of republics must direct the economic and cultural development of the republic to the fulfillment of that combined task. We cannot leave the question whether society's work is moral or evil to the irrationalistic hedonism of Adam Smith's free trade dogmas. We, both as individuals and as society, are responsible for the consequences of our policies of practice, for our acts and also for our acts of omission.
All right, I'm going to end it with that high point and open it up for any discussion or questions.
Okay, the microphone is here for anybody who has a question or a comment. You can also have a response to what was said. Yeah, go ahead.
It would seem that in order to be able to do the measurements of an economy in the way that Lynn has indicated, would require a total revolution in the way that national accounting statistics are done. Because essentially, I mean, take, for instance, sports, or take movies, and in terms of what category those belong to, because it requires what I guess would today, by today's accountants, would be a value judgment, i.e. you'd have to describe, I mean, you know, there's certain sports which are very useful and socially necessary and good for people's health and so forth. But then again, the obsessive mass sports phenomenon, which millions of resources are wasted on, would have to be, you know, not included. And the same thing goes for other aspects of culture and so forth. I was just wondering if you'd want to talk about this question of the nature of national accounting statistics.
Well, of course, that's precisely the kind of issue which is implied by what Lyndon LaRouche develops in these video excerpts in all of his writings. And he has, for instance, rejected the whole the national accounting, which is called GDP, which everybody accepts. This is like a simple hypothesis, which operates on the level of induction and deduction, logical induction and deduction. So you're supposed to accept this, and if you if you accept it, then I guess people will look on you favorably. And of course, and if you don't, then unfavorably. And of course, so much is made of GDP. in today's parlance. Whereas if you look at what Lyndon LaRouche lays out, sports, everything consumed in terms of production for sports or Hollywood really comes into the category of wasteful of waste, just as would be the case in terms of the drug culture. If you legalize drugs, then that would be part of the GDP. And yet it's actually committing menticide. It's destroying the creative powers that are necessary for the society to advance. And actually, what Lyndon LaRouche referred to in a number of locations is what he describes as the Playboy countercultural revolution, which was in a certain sense the forerunner of the 1960s rock music, drugs, sexual liberation movement, and which of course just obliterates the concept of productive. Or, for instance, the use of drugs like LSD, which were described as mind expanding, when in fact what they did, they were mind obliterating, and especially creativity. So I think the basic idea is that we have to replace such accepted prevailing measurements as GDP and so forth. We have to actually use these this method which Lyndon LaRouche lays out here if we're going to have an increase in the rate of potential relative population density in our own country or throughout the world. This becomes a very important issue because ultimately any agreement between the four powers, between the United States, Russia, China, India, and anyone else who wants to join that, is going to have to involve a new monetary system, because the transatlantic monetary system, which is dominated by the City of London, by Wall Street, is effectively bankrupt, as are many of the largest banks, as we saw back in 2008. And of course, those banks are in large part sustained by drug money laundering. I mean, that's well known. There were when Operation Fast and Furious was being investigated, it came to light that the Justice Department was authorizing drug money laundering on the part of Mexican cartels in order to sustain the banks. They actually gave the authority. And when the House Oversight Committee found this out and wanted to explore it, the investigation was immediately shut down. Or there's the famous case of a Wall Street, I guess he was head of the New York Stock Exchange, who went down to Colombia, Grasso, and it was Grasso, the big embrace of the drug cartel, the FARC. He actually went to meet with the FARC in Colombia for the same reason. So the point is, we have got it's sort of like the British Opium War today, and it's part of our accounting. In many countries, prostitution and pimping would be recognized as a value in a country's GDP. So we have to shift this altogether. Now, there's a paper which Lyndon LaRouche wrote, I think, in the year 2000, which we've been looking at more closely recently. It's basically discusses a transition to a new international monetary system, and it's called trade without currencies. And of course, Nixon took the dollar off the gold reserve standard, which was set up during the Bretton Woods process. And we now have a floating exchange rate. And if you're going to have investments over 25 years or 50 years in terms of basic economic infrastructure development in third world countries, the export of capital goods to third world countries so they can develop, you have to have fixed exchange rates so that you don't have massive cost overruns, which effectively destroy the projects. And what Lyndon LaRouche proposes is that it's, you know, it shouldn't be a basket. The fixed exchange rate should not be based on a basket of currencies, but based on a basket of commodities. And so instead of fixing the currencies to a value of gold, you would be fixing the currency, which was done in the Bretton Woods system. You would be fixing the exchange rates of the currencies in respect to a basket of hard commodities. But if you read that article, he doesn't specify a list of hard commodities. What he does is he goes through this discussion in terms of potential relative population density. The potential relative population density concept has to be the basis for establishing fixed exchange rates among nations as we move forward. And this is something that really has to be worked through. And what it does is it goes to to Lyndon LaRouche's revolutionary conception of potential relative population density as the accounting, as establishing the accounting measures that should be actually used. In the old Bretton Woods system, fixing currency, you had the U.S. dollar as the international currency, and the gold was at $35 an ounce, which at that point was the cost of production. Obviously, cost of production has grown massively since then. And then other currencies were fixed in relationship to the dollar within like a 1% band. So, but the key to the Bretton Woods system was that was not so much those particular arrangements, but rather that the U.S. economy was expanding and productive. So the underlying strength of the U.S. economy after World War II, but also after what Roosevelt had done in the 1930s, prior to World War II, was the actual basis for the Bretton Woods system. That's in large part disappeared, particularly in terms of the United States and Europe as we deindustrialized, as we moved into the post-industrial society. So this becomes a very important issue right now because from the document that Dennis quoted in the beginning, one of the things that the United States and Russia should be agreeing upon, and other nations as well, is the export of capital goods to the so-called developing world. China's doing much of that now, but the United States is not. There should be agreements to do that so that we eliminate poverty throughout the world and we create a productive workforce, not only in our own country, but also, and in other more developed countries, but also in the developing sector. And the point he makes is if you export capital goods to third world nations, you are gearing up your own capital goods industry, which is beneficial to you. And at the same time, you are increasing the productive powers of labor in the developing sector country, because you're not just outsourcing jobs to a third world country to exploit cheap labor. And when we did that with free trade, it also deindustrialized our economy. It reduced the potential relative population of our economy by outsourcing. But it didn't benefit the countries to which the jobs fled. A good example is Mexico. Mexico, under free trade policies of NAFTA, no longer produces beans or corn. They import them. And my wife is originally from Mexico, and she told me about a situation where she and her cousin, when they were younger, went to one of these sweatshops, the maquiladora, in order to, they were thinking about getting a job. And what they found was so horrible that they just turned around. What they found is that there were young women who were living in shacks, like 8 women living in one shack with with an outhouse. And they were just being exploited for their cheap labor. And a lot of these women came from southern portion of Mexico, such as Chiapas, which is extraordinarily poor. And they came up there and they did this work. And my wife told me that it was just very sad to see, like when some of these girls would then be going back to Chiapas, they were so proud because they had raised enough money to buy some simple household appliance, which their family had never been able to afford. But what you see, and Lyndon LaRouche has pointed this out, is that with free trade of that sort and outsourcing, you're exploiting low wage income, and there's no investment in infrastructure. So you're cheating those people, even at the same time that you have destroyed your own economy. And that's effectively what President Trump is trying to reverse. There are a couple elements that are missing in his approach. One is this agreement for capital exports to third world countries. This was critical in the Marshall Plan. Now, in the Marshall, remember, Bretton Woods was actually a proposal of Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt was a Hamiltonian. At Harvard, he wrote his thesis on Hamilton. I think it's his great, maybe great-grandfather or great-great-grandfather, Isaac Roosevelt, was a direct collaborator of Alexander Hamilton. So he didn't have, then there was the John Maynard Keynes idea of Bretton Woods, which Roosevelt rejected. And Roosevelt had said that what he wanted to do was to use American system methods to develop the third world after World War II, to build projects like the Tennessee Valley Authority, the kind of projects which China has built with its water management programs and so forth. But after Roosevelt died and Truman came in, basically Churchill succeeded in introducing a Cold War atmosphere so that original idea of Roosevelt's was not implemented, because many of the European countries, which were colonial powers, wanted to maintain their colonial status after World War II, including Churchill. And so therefore, the only thing that occurred was the reconstruction of Germany, much other places in Europe, but primarily Germany, and also reconstruction of Japan. But so it wasn't the full-scale program, and it occurred under Cold War geopolitical conditions. But what was significant about it is that it was a capital exporting policy to those countries. And by exporting capital and rebuilding those economies were then able to repay the investment in them. And that's what you would have globally. Countries throughout the world could repay their the credit extended to them for such development through an increase in their productive powers. And that's the overall policy. That is a win-win policy. That is a concept of respecting national sovereignty and at the same time embracing a community of principle among sovereign nation states. So I think that's so getting to this question of national accounting, the ideas that Lyndon LaRouche developed are essential in bringing about such arrangements today, such agreements today between the U.S., Russia, China, India, and other countries, so that we can. The protectionism is, excuse me, is protectionism historically is designed to protect the productive powers of your workforce. There are means in terms of international agreements for a new monetary system and capital goods export to develop the third world, which would actually are absolutely necessary components of a policy to enhance the productive powers of not only your own workforce, but of that of other countries. tariffs are valid, but they really have to be situated within that larger context in order to achieve the objective which we require.
Okay, we have 4 questions by email. We have 3 or 4 questions also from Texas. And I saw a few people here have questions. I think there's at least 2 here. Just want everybody to know, so with about 10 questions, here's what we'll do. I'll take one which came in email rather early today. So I want to take that one, and then we'll go to Texas. Okay. All right. So this question is from Boston. And they ask, is it the case that for a society to tend mainly toward the entropic state, that society would need not entirely use up all of its current technologies, natural resources?
The only way you can avoid entropy ultimately is by developing your population's mental capacity so that you generate higher hypotheses, which create scientific revolutions, which can be implemented in terms of technological advance. And that really is the only way you can do it. By doing that, you are also redefining your resource base, so you will never run out of resources. For instance, fusion powers can use deuterium, which is derived from seawater. It's virtually unlimited on the Earth. There are more efficient fuels for fusion power, including helium-3, which is in abundance on the surface of the moon. So if we have a space program and we extract the helium-3 on the moon, it's even more unlimited than deuterium here on Earth, and more effective apparently. And of course, that's just the Earth and the moon. And so, but it redefines resources altogether. With fusion power, you're also talking about something called a fusion torch, which uses the plasma of produced by fusion to recycle all garbage, to recycle radioactive waste produced by fission power plants. There is nothing to fear about radioactive waste, because if we develop fusion, we can recycle it into its constituent elements and defang it. And you can basically sort out all the constituent elements of rock, of garbage, of whatever, you can name it. So the point is, there are no limits to growth, because there are no limits to resources. They're not finite if you are developing new technologies which have higher energy flux densities.
Okay, let's go to Texas. Make sure we can hear.
Okay. Can you stand right here? Okay. Yeah. Oh. My question is, what's the ideal rate of manufacturing population to agriculture population for the development of a society? Does it exist? Thank you.
Could you repeat? We had a little audio problem here. Just speak a little bit more slowly.
I'll repeat it for her. She said, what is the ideal rate of manufacturing population to agricultural population for the development of society? Does it exist?
China may have something relevant to that.
Mm-hmm. Great ratio, yeah.
Which thing?
No, the population, one that I use.
Okay.
I think he's looking for it. Yeah, there it is.
Well, I'll just say that in So You Wish to Learn About Economics, Lyndon LaRouche argues that you want to raise the percentile of employed operatives, that is productively employed operatives, within the total labor force to about 50% of the labor force. And as you saw from what I showed, that it was far below 50% in 1979, and that's what, 40 years ago, 39 years ago. The further point that he makes is that you want to increase the employment in research and development to the range of 5% of the labor force. Now, in terms of what you're raising with respect to agriculture, I think that I don't think that there's a fixed percentage which Lyndon LaRouche has put forward. I think from one of the charts he talked about, let's see, yeah, here. With technological progress, the ratio of required employment in physical production and manufacturing and basic economic infrastructure must increase relative to agriculture and related activity up to a lower asymptotic limit of the latter. He doesn't specify what that should be there, but I think that that would be a reflection of what level is required under conditions of technological progress to sustain the population as a whole. Let me see what this says, because I can't see it from behind the. Okay. All right. So, when is this, Dennis? What do you have any idea? Right. But what's the year at 27% manufacturing? Okay. Okay, so that's, all right, that's when the book came out. Okay. So at that point, you had 3% agriculture in the United States. But it obviously varies in many countries all over the world. As I said, when the United States was first formed, it was well over 50% agriculture. Someone said 80%. So again, the places like China, India, Africa, many other locations in the world, it would be, what you need to do is to reduce the percentage. I can't give you an exact percentage, but reduce, here it is 3% in the United States in 1984. But you do that by increasing the use of science, the use of the productive labor force to increase the productivity of each individual farmer's household through mechanization, fertilization, irrigation, and other such scientific developments. There have been, I saw, for instance, in China, they've developed a rice that can be grown in water which has been affected by salt. So, there are scientific developments. We've had the green revolution, not in the sense of green ideology, but a green revolution with, throughout the world where much more productive forms of rice and other staples of a diet have been developed, all of which contradicts Parson Malthus, the British ideologue, who argued that population growth expands exponentially, but agriculture only arithmetically. Therefore, we have too many people and have to commit genocide. That was the British policy, the justification of their genocidal imperial policy from the word go. So the point being, as he said in that last quote I have, you reach an asymptotic level. That is, you approach a most efficient level. But the basic point is you're modernizing your agriculture, reducing the operatives in agriculture, but that requires increasing your productive labor force in the United States to at least 50%, and increasing your science and your research and development proportion, which is, I know, something that certainly China has done. And that's something that we used to do, but have strayed away from very, very much with this post-industrial society ideology. So hopefully that answers your question.
Back to Heather.
No question.
Now for
They're switching back and forth. Okay, there's a couple more for you.
Well, I find this fascinating. The formulas elude me, but the more elaborating on what the formulas mean is useful. And what would be helpful to me, and I think maybe other people also, is how does the Marshall Plan post-World War II relate, or how is that a parallel to what is needed in Africa, or even to help the poverty-stricken people here in America, much less elsewhere in the world? I'd love to hear, and I think other people know a tad about the Marshall Plan, but it would be useful to hear an expert's who's probably more knowledgeable about it and how it might apply to today. Thank you.
Well, Germany's experience under the Marshall Plan was known as the German economic miracle. Back in, I think it was 1964, I studied in Germany, and the thing that struck me was you still had, in a certain sense, buildings which were destroyed, but then you had this other activity of reconstruction that had taken place. There was a bank that was created in Germany. It was called the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau, which means Credit Institute for Reconstruction. And in a certain sense, it was modeled after Roosevelt's Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which he had developed in the United States in the 1930s. And it was, for Roosevelt, it was a way of bypassing the Federal Reserve, which is not a national bank. The Federal Reserve was created by the British back in I think it was 1913. It's a central bank, as with the Bank of England and all of these banks. And as you see, Federal Reserve doesn't issue credit. All it does is raise and lower interest rates. That seems to be its primary function, besides doing as little as possible to improve the economy. It's basically a private institution out of the control of the government, whereas Hamilton's conception was that you must have national bank and that the government itself should run that national bank and should issue credit, low interest credit, for real productive development of the nation. And so the basic point is that Germany obviously was virtually completely destroyed after the Second World War, I'm not an expert on this, but the basic idea was that credit was made available. I believe there was also capital goods export to Germany so that it could actually redevelop. And what Lyndon LaRouche has argued is that the effort to rebuild Germany increased the productive powers of Germany and of the productivity of its economy, such that Germany was able to repay any credit extended and pay for any capital goods exported to Germany. So the way in which this would work today, for instance, take Mexico. I tend to take Mexico because we have a major immigration crisis in respect to Mexico and Central America. The incoming president of Mexico, Lopez Obrador, has said that in his discussion with President Trump, he proposed development projects as part of a universal solution to the problem in U.S.-Mexican relations. We don't know the content of his proposal. I don't. But the basic idea is that back in the late 70s, early 1980s, Lyndon LaRouche had made a proposal, And I actually ran for US Senate in California back in 1982 and traveled to Mexico with this idea, which was that we would, and he made his proposal to President Portillo of Mexico at that time. And the basic idea was that Mexico would sell us oil in exchange for our providing them with capital goods so they could develop. And Lopez Portillo wanted to build 100 cities. I think I may have mentioned this in previous classes. 100 cities so that you wouldn't have just the congestion in one big city like Mexico, where you have like 22 million people now. But rather you develop the country as a whole through building 100 cities, and you also wanted to develop nuclear power plants. So that's, now perhaps the oil for technology deal wouldn't function per se today, but the example of the Marshall Plan would. That if we were to provide capital goods to Mexico, as opposed to these sweatshops that I was describing earlier, all right, if we were to do that, we would actually, and you know, I mean, I have relatives who also work in Ford assembly plants in Sonora, Mexico, so I'm familiar with how this thing has worked. But if we produce export capital goods to Mexico, that would increase the productivity of their economy. It would mean that people would have productive jobs there at decent wages. It would allow them to develop their infrastructure. And I can assure you that Mexicans would prefer to stay in Mexico. That's their home. They only come out of desperation, and similarly with Central America. But if you had this policy, that would create jobs in the United States. And it would mean that, so you benefit the United States, and at the same time, you're benefiting Mexico, and it would be a major step in the direction of solving the immigration question. Similarly with Africa. So there's discussion of a Marshall Plan for Africa, but you cannot have a Marshall Plan for Africa if you're merely proposing solar panels and what the World Bank calls appropriate technology. That is technology which does not sustain an industrial economy, but perhaps provides a little bit of energy on a village level without changing anything. So you have to have a Marshall Plan which is not based on renewable energy resources, such as Germany has currently committed itself to by abandoning nuclear power and coal-fired plants. You have to have an industrial and development plan. You have to have basic infrastructure development. That's what the Chinese are doing. That's what the Schiller Institute has proposed and has worked out very, very specific plans for doing. You see that, this was mentioned in last night's class for younger people, that, I mean, there's some very interesting developments occurring. It's been announced that, well over 1 million Syrian refugees will soon be able to return to Syria. I saw a story today which said that France is working with Russia to bring medical supplies to East Ghouta, which is just outside of Damascus, and that Russian cargo planes are flying from France to Damascus. If you get this kind of program, if you reconstruct Syria, if you reverse the damage that was done in Libya, then and you develop Africa, there's no reason why the populations of those sovereign nation states are going to have to flee under life-threatening conditions to go to Europe. So that's the policy you have to have, and the Marshall Plan effectively accomplished that on a limited scope, but and it had this problem of occurring in a geopolitical setting of anti-Russia policies of Churchill. But nonetheless, there's an economic principle that worked. And so that's what we have to do today.
Okay, this is a question from New York. I have a question for Will. Where does retail or final consumer distribution fit into this economic paradigm? We need a portion of the workforce employed in this non-productive, he says, but also non-overhead category. What percentage should it be? Non-productive categories like retail typically don't pay much. How do you plan to generate a living standard with this category of labor?
Oops. Well, I'm when you said retail initially, I was thinking of clothing and things of this sort. But maybe you also mean fast food. I guess you call fast food enterprises and so forth. I mean, there again, you have to make a distinction between what are the consumer products which actually enhance the living standard of the population and contribute to making the population as a whole more productive. So people who are involved in retail are not directly involved in production per se. But again, with retail, if you're selling goods which are necessary for the population as a whole and their well-being, then that merely is located in the non-productive sector, but it's socially necessary. So you have to make a distinction in terms of what's socially necessary and what is not. So that's, I think, pretty much what I can say at this point. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, that's it.
Others of us will avoid making very bad jokes about that. Can we go to Texas? Like, once you have real full productive employment available to people, if anyone is knowingly, wittingly selling a McDonald's hamburger, they're going to be charged for crimes against humanity, the International Criminal Court.
Just stay right here, right? Stay right here.
Uh-huh.
Ready? Okay.
I can hear you.
I want to hear your thoughts on this question. It says, okay, God said, not by might, not by power, but by spirit. How would you say I should feel about Lynn's plan as it relates to God's word until man has exhausted all his plans of salvation? Will I come?
Well, if you follow the videotape closely, Lynn's economic policy starts out with Genesis. Be fruitful, multiply, and subdue the earth. And actually, his Power of Labor tape begins with that quote. And then later, as you may have seen, he refers to the Logos in the Gospel of St. John, because that concept in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos in that opening chapter becomes flesh. And essentially, man, in the living image of the Creator, is and must be an embodiment of the Logos, of creative reason. So you combine those two passages as he does in his writing, and I think you have a very clear description of what it means, what the responsibility is of a human being. It's the principle of love. If you actually love your fellow man, then you must develop the productive powers of your creative powers of your mind, so as to benefit your fellow man. And if you're not developing technology, making the scientific breakthroughs which make that possible, you're not developing your mind so that you can assimilate such breakthroughs, even if you personally aren't the generator of those breakthroughs, then you're not doing everything that you could do to benefit your fellow man, because if that's not done, that's an act of omission. Remember, at his last statement was, you have to look at this, there's a moral purpose here. And you have to look at it from the standpoint of what are your actions and what are your acts of omission. So the point is that this is a moral responsibility. It has to do also with the commandment to love one's neighbor, and also those people that you may perceive as your enemy, which goes to the principle, for instance, of our foreign policy. It should be based on the Treaty of Westphalia. And the theme of the Treaty of Westphalia, which ended 30 years religious war in Europe in the 1600s, was that you have to operate from the standpoint of the benefit or the advantage of the other. And if you do that, you transform the other even as you're transforming yourself. And so what I would say is that, I mean, that's, you know, what we're talking about here is man is in the living image of the Creator. That gives us a certain responsibility, which we can't avoid. And that's been given to us. And so it's an active conception of man's responsibility in terms of increasing potential relative population density. I mean, there's perhaps more that I could say on this, but I think that that's the most important thing to say. The first class I gave, I showed a picture of a cartoon that Lyndon LaRouche always used in his classes back in the 1970s by Abner Dean. And with somebody basically in a coffin in a funeral procession, and he was the people in the procession looked very mindless, they looked very hedonistic, just and they were all naked. And maybe it was the person, Abner Dean had a foreshadowing of the hedonism that was going to come to dominate much of Western society, particularly if the policies of Adam Smith, you know, were to predominate. But the basic point is, he says, what was that all about? And we each must know what our lives are all about. We have to. It's like the New Testament parable about the talents. You don't just bury your talents. You use your talents to benefit others. And you will. That's the way in which you are fruitful and you multiply. You use your talents to increase potential relative population density. It's a negentropic idea in that parable. So that's the best I can answer it right now. I hope that's helpful to you.
Okay. Here, somebody, go to the microphone.
Okay. Presentation was so rich today. I have to thank you all for this program of classes, which is extremely enriching. And for myself, I'll speak for myself, I need to go over it many times. And I have a list of the books that we're reading, which is very long. And I'm working on this one. It's interesting that you reference this today, because there's a section here, this is in Project A, which is the second book in this 3-part series, Science of Christian Economy. And there's 2 chapters. There's one chapter that's titled, What is Change? Which has a couple of pages. And the other one is, the next chapter is Change and No Change. And since I think we are a group, a movement that is interested in change, what it is, this part really caught me. And I haven't gotten much beyond it over the last several weeks, because in What is Change, he talks about axioms. And I began to realize that in me, I'm operating from an axiom, or many axioms. And he defines it. I'll just read what he says here about it, just to give a little reference. If you have an axiom, here's like your starting point. And he says that, okay, from the standpoint of A, let's say A for axiom or axiom A, if there's something that happens, only certain things can follow from that axiom. And if something happens that is not in line with that, then it's considered anomalous. And he says, from the standpoint of A, that example, an anomalous aspect of an event which differs from an acceptable axiom of A or is inconsistent with A will simply be disregarded as erroneous, a non-real occurrence. People will say, well, you know, that didn't really occur. It couldn't have occurred because, and so on and so forth. So my memory of axioms comes from my course, high school course in geometry, where you start with an axiom, and you don't question that, because that is your starting point, and that is assumed to be real and truthful and inviolable. And when I was studying it, and I was not the greatest math whiz. When I got to geometry and there were axioms, somehow or other, I felt very comforted by that. I felt like it was stable. I could understand that. I could do that. But now I'm looking at my life and I'm saying, well, I'm operating from axioms, and you know, maybe they need to be questioned. So this is why, you know, it's going on. So, and then the next chapter he talks about why doesn't change happen, and he says, same thing is true in politics. Which set of underlying political principles, notions of the nature of God, man, and nature in general guides us to form some practice which corresponds to an increasing power of mankind over nature and the increasing security of a society. And then a little later down, he says, let's see, I hope I get the right sentence here. This involves also, as we have already indicated, the case in which an event has occurred which is anomalous and which thereby would tend to require an overthrowing of existing sets of axioms and postulates, at least implicitly so. But we refuse to recognize that event, or we refuse to recognize the aspect of the event which represents this challenge. We do this in order to defend the system of axioms and postulates in use against the threat which is represented by this anomalous event, or an anomalous aspect of the event. So even though a change might seem to be required by the anomalous event, no change occurs. And I'm looking at that in my own life. But the other day I had a conversation with someone, and you know, in New York, everybody knows about.
We have other people, so just
yeah, I'll get through. Okay. So got into a conversation with a man, and we were you know, in New York, we have the problem of trains, the subways, which don't run very well, and there's many problems. And I said to the man, well, have you seen the trains in China, those high-speed trains that they have in China? And he thought, this was a very thoughtful, intelligent man. And this is, we were having a very nice exchange. He said, well, you know, in New York, our system is so old. And he said, we have all these old tracks. We couldn't put high-speed trains on these tracks. I said, but we don't need high-speed trains to go to 42nd Street. We need high-speed trains to go to Washington, to Miami, to Atlanta, to St. Louis, to San Francisco, and so on and so forth. And it really caught me because what struck me about it was that our current conditions become axiomatic on what we think is possible. So I'm wondering if you can explore that a little bit, because I think we're held up. We get stuck there.
Well, this goes right to the issue of that Lyndon LaRouche was addressing in terms of simple hypothesis. And he makes the point that this is, at the level of simple hypothesis, you're operating on a certain assumption or an axiom, which basically leads you to certain conclusions. And it's what's called a fixed theorem lattice. And as he said there, simple hypothesis is below the level of creative thinking. It's below, and if there's an anomaly, as you were quoting, an inconsistency, then you have to generate a higher hypothesis. And it's that higher hypothesis which overthrows that axiom. And if you remember, what he was saying is people go along with simple hypotheses because it's prevalent, because people in the field of the scientific work, for instance, that's the prevailing opinion. You don't want to challenge that because they might think badly of you. All right? I mean, for how many centuries was the idea that the Earth was flat accepted? Because it was like a police state, that if you say it's not flat, or if the Earth is not the center of the universe, then you're engaged in blasphemy of some sort or other, and you'll be persecuted. So that's the notion of the question of what prevents people from when they find an inconsistency or anomaly from developing a higher hypothesis is primarily social and psychological. You're basically operating in a police state. You may not get ahead. You may not be accepted. You may not get a good grade on a paper in school. You may be blackballed in your job and not get advances because you wouldn't accept some axiomatic assumption. So that's what you're dealing with, and but society only progresses if, when you find an anomaly, you find an inconsistency that's not explained by this simple hypothesis or axiom, you then develop a higher order conception. And as he said, a higher hypothesis can never be challenged by a simple hypothesis because it's been overthrown. So what you have to do is create a situation in which people are willing to fight to overthrow false axiomatic assumptions and to develop higher hypotheses, or if somebody else has developed it, to explore with your own mind in an inner-directed manner, not based on what other people think. Inner-directed manner, is this valid? This higher hypothesis, and society grows on that basis. If you are afraid to explore a higher hypothesis, if you want to ignore the anomaly, then you have a collapse of society. For instance, when I developed Nicholas Couze's refutation of Archimedes in the quadratic circle, people like Galileo and others denied that there was an anomaly. And you're using the example of plane geometry and so forth, and that's Euclid. So they denied it. They said, well, there's only one kind of angle, a rectilinear angle. You can't have an angle which has one straight side and the other side of the angle is semicircle, as in a circle. So they say it doesn't exist. So we'll just ignore it. That's what they did. So I think that it's what you've raised is really at the core of what Lyndon LaRouche is developing in terms of how a society progresses and how it destroys itself.
Okay, we have another question we've gotten, which is, okay, we have one more question for Texas, which Texas will take right in a minute. And this is the next question we have. This is from Derek. LaRouche's economic theories are spot on, but how does international law, or lack thereof, affect the metric of this model? For example, intellectual property theft, currency manipulation. The reason I think that this is important is that if you don't have a catch-all provision, your as planned versus as built implementation will break down. Thanks, that's the question, so that's it.
Well, that's why you have to, it's urgent that we arrive at a four powers agreement between the United States, Russia, China, and India. Because the questions of currency manipulation, intellectual theft, and so forth, these really only are going to be solved if you create a new monetary system in which the emphasis is on potential relative population density increases, and there's an understanding on everybody's part that that's the case. And you create a situation where it becomes clear to people that nothing is to be gained by currency manipulation, because that's a result of the floating exchange rate, the currency manipulation. But if you have a fixed exchange rate based on potential relative population density, that's not a problem. And if you actually develop trust among leading nations in the world, and you have a joint commitment to developing the productive powers of all nations, then questions such as intellectual theft are not going to be the problem which they may appear to be under the current circumstances, in which you've got people basically geopolitics dominating. And this statement that Dennis referred to that Lyndon LaRouche wrote in 1984 on U.S., at that time was the Soviet Union agreement, the community of interest among sovereign nation states was defined in terms of a joint commitment to increasing the productive powers of the populations of all nations. That is defined as the common interest of Russia and the United States, according to Lyndon LaRouche. You have that, the other issues will be resolved.
Let's go to Texas.
Okay, survey again.
Yes, people really should go to Texas if you need help down in Spain, but I guess we can get to that a little bit later.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the deep analysis of book of LaRouche. And my question is, does in the book we have a detailed analysis of the future of the economic which based on production or consumption? This is two categories, production and consumption. And what's your opinion how this two type of economics will coexist in the future, and how the political structure of the countries will affect this? This is one. A second, can you clarify your position about logos, which connected with the Plato, Pluto Republic, and your quote from the Bible, the logos, at the beginning was the word, and word is the God. How do you think how LaRouche connected these two completely different positions, production, consumption, and he turned the final verse in your presentation was about logos. How you connected two unconnected things, economic and logos, the love and economic, capitalism of Marx and the logos of Christianity. Thank you.
All right, well. Well, if you go back to the bar diagrams, again, you're talking about it's the C and the V. So, and V is really the consumption consumption of the population, and C is the investment in capital goods. And what he says is that the ratio C over V has to increase. It's not that one. I think you'd have to. So your capital intensity has to increase as a result of your production. So it's in a certain sense a paradox, because you're raising the standard of living, the consumption of your workforce, in order for them to be able to be more productive. But the value of the ratio of production of capital goods to consumption is increasing, because you're increasing your investment in C, which is the capital goods production. So that defines and you've got to have technological progress introduced in respect to your production, C, if you're going to be able to continue to increase the rate of profit as a whole. So it's in that sense a sort of a paradoxical relationship where the consumption is dependent upon increases in the capital intensity of your production. So that's essentially what he lays out. I'd also like to just go back to what the lady said earlier in terms of having to reread these passages a number of times. That's not unusual. You really have to study this material. For instance, I looked at the first video clip at least 3 or 4 times to really try to master it. So it's a challenge you just have to work on. The question of what he's doing at the end is 2 things. He's relating Plato's conception of the unhypothesized. Just a second. The unhypothesized principle. Let me just, I'll read some from Plato's discussion of this. First of all, he goes after the Euclidean geometers. He says, for I think you are aware that students of geometry and reckoning and such subjects first postulate the odd and the even and the various figures and 3 kinds of angles and other things akin to these in each branch of science, regard them as known and treating them as absolute assumptions or axioms, do not deign to render any further account of them to themselves or others. Taking it for granted, they are obvious to everyone. Then he says, this then is the class that I describe as intelligible. It is true, but with the reservation, first, that the soul is compelled to employ assumptions in the investigation of it, not proceeding to a first principle because of its inability to extricate itself from and rise above its assumptions. This is, if you can go to the divided line of Plato. Yeah. There. What he's basically saying is that you have, and this gets to the logos issue. I'm trying to get to that. Basically, you have sense perception, which is the perception of sensible objects. And this is in the visible domain. In the intelligible domain, you have something called mathematical objects. This is what Lyndon LaRouche refers to as a simple hypothesis. This involves logical deduction. This is Aristotle. Essentially, you have a sense perception, and then you generalize from the sense perception, which is called induction, to arrive at a simple hypothesis or an assumption, an axiom, from which then you deduce conclusions without ever going to a higher principle. And this is Aristotelian logical deduction. But there's a higher standard, and it's usually called rationality, but it's basically logical deduction. There's a higher quality of the human mind, which is creative intellect. And that is what Plato refers to as a higher hypothesis. He says as follows, understand then that by the other section of the intelligible, I mean that which the reason itself lays hold of by the power of dialectic, treating its assumptions not as absolute beginnings, but literally as hypotheses, underpinnings, footings, and springboards, so to speak, to enable it to rise to that which requires no assumption and is the starting point of all. And that's the unhypothesized principle, or the good itself, which is shown on the left at the top. The references to first, third, second, and third heaven come from Nicholas of Cusa, who argues that when the Apostle Paul was converted on the Damascus Road, he said that he was raptured into a third heaven. And what Nicholas of Cusa argues is that means he actually came into harmony with creative reason, as opposed to logical deduction or sense perception, which led him to actually persecute Christians at that time, which, as is known, he was doing. Now, so the point here is that from the standpoint of Plato, the absolute good is unhypothesized. That's what Lyndon LaRouche developed in that final section, unhypothesized principle. And we approach that as human beings because we don't have the mind of God. We're merely the living image of the Creator. So we are engaged in a search. Nicholas of Cusa says it's a search for God. You could say it's a search in the direction of the unhypothesized. And Lyndon LaRouche associates the idea of Plato's unhypothesized principle of the absolute good with the logos as the word as creative reason. And the basic idea here is that the physical universe, in fact, is based upon the creative reason of the logos. And this coheres with what I developed in the last time I was here in terms of Nicholas of Cusa's conception of potential itself. The universe is not entropic. That man, through the use of his reason, develops that which is latent as a potential within the physical universe. Lyndon LaRouche has the concept of psychophysical parallelism. There's a direct relationship between the way in which the mind is organized. We don't operate on the basis of merely sense perception or logical deduction. We operate, if we're advancing as a society, based upon creative intellect, developing higher hypotheses, and realizing that that we are capable of generating a succession of higher hypotheses, which is the hypothesis of the higher hypothesis. And that is also the nature of the universe as mediated through man's intervention in the physical universe. There's an abiotic domain of non-living. There's living domain, which is the biosphere. And there's the noosphere, which is based on the Greek concept of noesis, or creative intellect. And the basic point of man is to become, the man, because of the nature of his mind, in the living image of the Creator, can become a geological force. There was one slide there from Lyndon LaRouche in the last segment where he talks about the fact that the mind is a physical force in the physical universe. So the basic point here is that his understanding of the Gospel of St. John is that it's an expression of the creative ordering of the universe according to the logos or the word, and that man, in terms of Christian theology, insofar as he's imitating Christ, is capable and also has responsibility for being an instrument for the further development of the physical universe. And that's what Lyndon LaRouche was addressing at the end in terms of the moral purpose that we have, which goes to this issue of what's in Greek, the word agape, but in English is love. It's also translated as charity for others. So that's the basic concept. He is rendering certain theological concepts intelligible in terms of human practice, and that way you avoid being doctrinaire and having blind faith in doctrines which are not you haven't bothered to think through in terms of whether they're true or not. That's what Nicholas of Cusa does. That's what Lyndon LaRouche does, I think, in all of his economic writings. I would recommend people read this, the book that the lady cited on Science of Christian Economy. It's a very, very good book, which he wrote while he was in prison.
Okay, so what we're going to do, both in the interest of time and also because we've reached a certain point here in the whole discussion, is Keisha has a few things, some things she wanted to say. We're going to have her go next. And then I think I'll have one last written question I'll refer to, and I think both Will and I will have something to say to that. So Keisha?
Okay. So what I wanted to convey is, as people know, I'm a candidate for Congress here, independent for Congress here in Texas, running against Congressman Al Green. And just in light of this discussion, I was out yesterday with some of my campaign team organizing in the streets and in the district, and we had a rally set up. And this is not the first time I experienced this, but there were a number, there was one individual in particular who came up and, said, ma'am, what are you going to do to make sure that we can get jobs? And this individual was actually out washing windows. And we've seen an increase of homelessness, people out washing windows. But what was unique about the situation is that he came up showing me his qualifications as a welder. Another gentleman who was basically holding up a sign for a company making a few dollars an hour, trying to find work, was a skilled electrician. And this is what a real example of an entropic process in society, and where you're seeing a collapse in the energy of the system, where you think about that yesterday, where you have this level of skill, you have skilled engineers or electricians, welders, who can't find work right now. What LaRouche is saying, it's not something that should just be completely over people's heads. The problem is we've been so immersed in a monetary system that we don't know what a productive society should represent anymore. And I was thinking about it, that yesterday was the 49th anniversary of the moon landing. And we've been 50 years of space exploration. But when you actually had a productive society economy, we organized the energies and talents of all of our population in every skill, increasing the energy of the system, increasing our productivity. We're not doing that any longer. So people should think about it from that standpoint. We're not talking about something that's completely abstract, but what is a productive society? Why do you have people out on the streets washing car windows who actually have this quality of skill? And as another question was asked earlier about the question of how this would relate in terms of increasing the productivity, the energy of the system to people in the retail sector or service economy or so forth. Well, think about the janitor working in the space program or the street sweeper or the cafeteria worker. As the productivity of the system increases, the productivity of everyone involved increases. So I think that we have to think about this completely differently, that LaRouche's 4 laws become urgent and pertinent in the situation we're in right now, where the Wall Street economy and the whole collapse of the system is continuing to destroy and kill our population.
This is just by way of responding in part to the question about axioms and hypotheses. This is from a paper from Lyndon LaRouche written back in 1984, which was called Cloak and Dagger 101. The difference between the top-rate spy and the bungler is that the good spies act on the basis of knowing that the most important things happening around them are the things that appear never to have happened at all. It is the things that aren't there that can really do you in. as the fellow said as he was falling down the empty elevator shaft. If you ever catch yourself drawing a conclusion from merely the list of facts you believe you have in your possession, stop yourself right there and think again. As the accountant told the judge, it was the cash that wasn't there that led to uncovering the embezzlement. Always be aware that you may have missed something of critical importance to making a decision. Make a list of the things which you didn't notice, things which might have happened or which may not have happened, which you did not notice. The most important events among those you have overlooked will usually be the non-events, events which never happened. The most important fact about a wedding is not the guest list or the bride's costume, but the fact that the groom is missing. Okay, so there's a final question I'm going to read. Well, it was a comment by someone who just said this about, and I think this applies sort of for the whole class, and I'm going to let Will answer that, and that'll be our concluding. Dear instructors, once again I am lost because I never studied thermodynamics and the use of scientific analogies in economic theory, and so forth and so on. This causes a brain glitch. Once again, I must suggest that LaRouche economics needs to be translated for dummies such as myself. So, that'll be our.
Well, respectfully, we don't consider you a dummy. And you shouldn't either.
Okay, so the LaRouche Political Action Committee and our class series, we're going to call it an end of this, and we'll see you next week.